The shuttle bay doors hadn't finished cycling when the foreman told him he was late. Ren Calder stepped off the transport with his kit bag over one shoulder, his boots still carrying dust from the last station, and found a Vaelori dockmaster blocking the gangway with a data slate and an expression that suggested human punctuality had once again failed to impress. The dockmaster was tall, they all were. The Vaelori, 2 meters and change, skin the color of birch bark dusted with frost, hair like spun titanium wire, and he looked down at Ren the way a building looks down at a fire hydrant. Maintenance technician Calder, you were expected at shift mark 7, it is now shift mark 9. The transport was delayed at the relay junction, Ren said. Coolant leak in the docking clamps. I fixed it for them so they'd let us leave. The dockmaster's pale violet eyes didn't blink. Your assignment is Bay 14, hull panel realignment on a private vessel. Report to lead technician Orath. Do not deviate from the bay path. Do not engage with ship personnel. Do not enter restricted sections. Your access badge is gray. He held out a thin metal card. Gray, the lowest clearance level in the Vaelori drydock system. It would let Ren into the maintenance corridors, the tool stores, and exactly one bathroom. He'd worn gray badges at every alien station he'd ever worked. They were designed to make you invisible, and they were very good at their jobs. Ren took the badge and clipped it to his collar. Bay 14, got it. The dockmaster had already turned away. The Kethvener Orbital Drydock was the largest privately operated repair facility in the Vaelori sovereignty's outer reach, a sprawling lattice of scaffold arms and pressurized work bays, wrapped around a central spine that extended nearly 2 kilometers through the void. Ren walked the main corridor toward Bay 14 and tried not to stare. He'd worked on human stations, on Drenari commercial platforms, on a Korvathi mining rig where the gravity plating had been installed upside down, and nobody had noticed for 6 years. But the Kethvener was something else. The corridor walls were seamless alloy polished to a mirror finish, threaded with pale blue veins of bioluminescent conduit that pulsed in a slow rhythm like a heartbeat. The air tasted clean, filtered to a standard that made hospital air seem gritty. Vaelori technicians moved past him in crisp gray-blue uniforms, their movements precise and unhurried, their conversations conducted in murmurs too low for his translation implant to catch. None of them looked at him. Gray badge, human, furniture that walks. He'd been furniture that walks since his first off-world job at 17, a pipe-sealing contract on a Drenari cargo depot where the supervisor had called him the human for 3 weeks straight, and then, when Ren's seal work had tested at twice the required pressure rating, had called him the useful human as if that were a promotion. Before that, his mother's repair shop on Meridian Station, where the work was the same but the invisibility was optional. His mother, Gail Calder, licensed structural technician, 41 years in the trade, hands like sandstone and a voice that could stop a leaky valve at 20 paces, had taught him everything that mattered in this profession. That every surface tells a story if you touch it long enough, that patience is a tool with a sharper edge than any wrench, and that dignity is something you carry in the quality of your work, not in the badge they pin to your collar. She'd worn a gray badge herself, once, 30 years ago, on a Vaelori refueling platform, where she'd rethreaded a cooling manifold that 3 Vaelori engineers had declared unrepairable. They'd offered her a silver badge afterward. She turned it down. A badge is their opinion of me, she told Ren. My work is my opinion of me. I know which one I trust. He passed a tool store window and caught his own reflection, 23 years old, lean, dark hair cut short enough to fit under a hard hat, work pants that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft at the knees and stiff at the pockets. Not imposing, not memorable. The kind of person you look through on your way to looking at someone else. He'd been that person his entire adult life, and most of the time it didn't bother him. Most of the time. Bay 14 was at the end of a secondary arm, past 2 security checkpoints where his badge got scanned with the enthusiasm of someone checking an expired coupon. At the second checkpoint, a Vaelori security officer, older, gray at the temples of his titanium wire hair, the insignia of a 20-year facility veteran on his collar, held the badge up and squinted at it as if trying to determine whether it was genuine or whether someone had made a gray badge out of scrap metal as a joke. "Maintenance tech," the officer said. "Bay 14, court-class vessel." "Yes, sir." The officer looked at him, looked at the badge, looked at him again. "You understand the protocols for court-class work. No direct communication with the vessel's occupants. No deviation from your assigned task. No documentation or recording of the vessel's interior layout." "I understand." The officer handed the badge back with 2 fingers, the way someone hands you a receipt they expect you to lose. "Bay 14, end of the arm." "Thank you." Ren walked on. The officer's gaze followed him for 10 steps and then let go, because gray badge humans weren't interesting enough to watch for more than 10 steps. When he stepped through the final pressure door, he stopped. The ship filled the bay. She was a private yacht, that much he'd been told in the work order, but the word yacht didn't do justice to what sat on the cradle arms in front of him. 60 meters stem to stern, her hull a flowing sweep of pearl-white composite layered over structural members that gleamed like polished bone. The design language was pure Vaelori court class. Organic curves, no visible seams, no hard angles, the whole thing looking less like something built and more like something grown. Her running lights were dark, and even powered down she was the most beautiful ship Ren had ever seen. She was also damaged. Along the port side, a section of hull paneling had been buckled inward, impact damage. Recent, the composite cracked in a radiating pattern like a frozen spiderweb. Scaffolding hugged the damaged section, and 2 Vaelori technicians were already up on the platform, their diagnostic tools throwing pale blue light across the fracture pattern. A third Vaelori stood at the base of the scaffolding with his arms crossed, lead technician Orath. Ren recognized the rank insignia, a silver chevron with a single pale crystal set into the center, and the posture of a man who had been told a human was joining his crew and hadn't been consulted about it. "Calder," Orath said. "Yes, sir." Orath looked at his badge. Gray. Something moved behind his eyes that was probably contempt but might have been pity, and Ren couldn't decide which was worse. "The vessel is the Solaneth, private commission, court-class registry. The owner is on board and does not wish to be disturbed. Your assignment is panel realignment on the port hull sections 41 through 60. The panels have shifted off their mounting rails by 3 to 9 millimeters due to impact compression. They need to be reset to within 0.02 millimeter tolerance." Ren processed that. 20 panels. Sub-millimeter tolerance on a composite that had been stress-deformed by impact. The Vaelori built their hull panels on interlocking microrail systems. Each panel sat on a track of tiny alignment pins that had to be seated precisely or the panel wouldn't seal, wouldn't distribute load correctly, and would eventually buckle again under normal flight stress. When the panels got knocked off their rails, you couldn't just hammer them back. You had to release each pin, clean the rail, reseat the pin, and verify the alignment with a gauge, 1 pin at a time. He'd done this work before. Once, on a Vaelori cargo hauler, where 15 panels had taken him 4 days. "How long do I have?" he asked. "The owner wants the vessel flight-ready in 36 hours. 20 panels, 0.02 tolerance, 36 hours. "I'll need a rail gauge," Ren said. "A manual one, not digital." Orath's brow ridges rose slightly. "We use the Kell series diagnostic array for alignment verification." "I've seen the Kell series. It rounds to 0.05. If your tolerance is 0.02, I need a manual gauge." "The Kell series meets our standard certification requirements for hull panel work." "Your certification requirements aren't wrong, but they're not .02 either. Oreth stared at him for a long moment. The two technicians on the scaffold had stopped working and were looking down at them. One of them, a young woman with pale lavender-tinted skin, and the narrow, precise hands of someone trained in composite repair, was watching Ren with the undisguised curiosity of someone who had never seen a human argue with a lead technician. Oreth spoke to her in rapid Vaelori. She climbed down, disappeared through a side door, and returned 3 minutes later with a case. Inside, nested in foam, was a Vaelori rail gauge, a handheld instrument about the length of Ren's forearm, machined from a single piece of crystal-threaded alloy, with graduated markings etched along its measuring edge in increments so fine they were nearly invisible. Ren picked it up. It was heavy, well-balanced, and clearly old. The grip had been worn smooth by years of use, and someone had scratched initials into the base Vaelori characters he couldn't read. But the gauge itself was immaculate. Whoever had owned this had treated it the way a musician treats an instrument. The measuring surfaces were free of nicks, the graduated lines still sharp, the calibration marks aligned with the kind of precision that machines approximated and hands perfected. "This will work," he said. "The tool store has 4 Kel series units available for immediate checkout," Oreth said. "They are calibrated to current specifications." "I'm sure they are." Oreth studied him. Ren could feel the calculation, the lead technician weighing the inefficiency of a single gray-badge human, using an antique hand gauge against the political complication of forcing the issue, and having the work turn out poorly. In the end, the calculation came down to the thing it always came down to in the Vaelori hierarchy. The result would speak, and the result would be either within tolerance or not, and no amount of arguing about methodology would change the numbers on the diagnostic. "Proceed," Oreth said. He gestured toward the scaffolding and walked away. His stride was exactly the same length as when he'd arrived. Nothing about him suggested he'd just made a concession. That was the Vaelori way decisions were made, and then treated as if they had always been obvious, which was either admirable efficiency or maddening revisionism, depending on your species. Ren climbed. The first panel was the worst. Section 41, at the forward edge of the damage zone, where the impact force had been strongest. The composite had been repaired. The Vaelori structural team had already done that work, rebonding the fractured layers with a catalytic resin that set harder than the original material, but the underlying rail system was a mess. Ren knelt on the scaffold platform, opened his kit, and ran the gauge along the first rail. 7 pins out of alignment. The worst one was off by 8.3 millimeters, nearly a centimeter of displacement. He could see why the digital array had been inadequate. At that scale of deformation, the Kel series would have flagged the gross misalignment and suggested a full rail replacement. But the rail itself was fine. The pins just needed to come home. He started with pin 1. Released the locking collar with a quarter turn of his wrench, cleaned the rail channel with a bristle brush, compressed debris, mostly fragments of shattered composite that had been driven into the track by the impact, repositioned the pin by hand, feeling for the moment the machined surfaces found each other, the tiny click that meant the tolerances had met, set the gauge, read it, off by .04, adjusted, read again, .01, locked the collar, moved to pin 2. It was slow, repetitive, precise work. The kind of work that machines did faster and humans did better, because a machine couldn't feel the difference between a pin that was seated and a pin that was almost seated. Ren's fingers knew. He'd been doing this since he was 17, when his mother had put a wrench in his hand in the back of her repair shop on Meridian Station, and told him that the measure of a technician wasn't speed, but the willingness to do the same thing correctly 500 times in a row. He'd done it correctly 500 times, then 1,000. Then he'd stopped counting and just did it, the same way you stop counting breaths. Pin 3, release clean seat gauge lock, pin 4. The rail channel on this one had a burr, a tiny lip of deformed metal from the impact. invisible to the eye but detectable by touch. He smoothed it with the fine file from his kit, tested the channel with his fingertip, felt the burr was gone, reseated the pin. The gauge read .008. His mother would have called that passable. He adjusted it to .003 and moved on. The first panel took him 90 minutes. When he was done, he ran the gauge along all 7 pins and checked the reading against the tolerance spec. All 7 within .02, most within .01. He pressed his palm flat against the panel's surface and felt for vibration. Nothing. The panel was dead still, seated so precisely that it had become part of the hull again, indistinguishable from the panels that had never been moved. He climbed down, drank water from the canteen in his kit, stretched his fingers until the knuckles popped, and climbed back up to panel 42. On the bay floor, the 2 Vaelori technicians who'd been doing composite work when he arrived were standing with Orath, speaking in low voices. Ren couldn't hear the words, but he could read posture. One of the technicians, the young woman, kept glancing up at the scaffold where he'd been working. The other was shaking his head slowly, a gesture that looked the same across species. Something about the way Orath stood, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, told Ren the lead technician was defending a position he hadn't expected to have to defend. Defending him, maybe. Or defending the decision to give a gray badge human a hand gauge and let him loose on a court-class hull. It didn't matter, the panels mattered. Panel 42 was worse than 41. 9 pins, 3 of them with fractured locking collars, and 1 pin that had been driven so far off its rail that the channel walls had deformed around it. Ren studied the deformation for a long time. The digital approach would have called for a channel replacement, pull the entire rail segment, install new. That was the spec. That was correct. But the channel wasn't broken, it was bent. The walls had compressed inward symmetrically, which meant the material was still good, still within its elastic limit. If he could spread the channel walls back to their original width without cracking them, the pin would seat without a replacement. He took 2 flat shims from his kit, thin alloy strips, the kind he carried for exactly this kind of situation, and wedged them gently into the compressed channel, 1 on each side, applying even pressure. Then he tapped the outer edges with the flat of his gauge, 3 times each side, light taps, persuasion rather than force. The channel walls moved. Not much, fractions of a millimeter, but enough. He removed the shims, tested the channel width, and found it within 0.5% of factory spec. The pin slid home like it had never been anywhere else. Halfway through panel 42, the young Vaelori composite technician climbed the scaffold to deliver a set of replacement resin patches for the next section. She set the case down near his tool kit and lingered, watching him work the compressed channel. "You are using shims to spread the channel walls," she said. Her eyes were fixed on his hands. "That is not standard procedure." "No," Ren said. "Standard procedure would be to replace the rail segment." "It would." "The rail segment replacement costs 1,400 credits in materials and takes 6 hours of additional labor. And the shims cost nothing and take 4 minutes." She was quiet for a moment, "But the result is equivalent." Ren looked up at her. She had the careful, serious face of someone early in their career, who was beginning to suspect that the procedures she'd memorized might not be the only way to do things, and that suspicion was both exciting and uncomfortable. "The result is better," he said. "A replacement segment has a factory joint at each end. Factory joints are within spec, but they're not seamless. Over time, thermal cycling puts stress on the joints. After 3 years, you start getting micro-fatigue at the connection points. The original channel, if you can save it, is one continuous piece, no joints, no stress concentration. It lasts longer." She stared at the shims in the channel. "How do you know the channel walls will not fracture when you spread them?" "Because the deformation was symmetrical. Both walls moved the same amount, which means the material yielded evenly. If one wall had compressed more than the other, the crystalline structure would be disrupted asymmetrically and you'd get fracture lines. These walls are just pushed in. They want to come back. The pins want to come home. The walls want to come back. She paused. You speak about the materials as if they have preferences. They do. Every material has a shape it wants to be. The job is to help it get there. She didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted, a door opening, or maybe a window, and Ren recognized it because he'd seen the same expression on his own face years ago, when his mother had said something that turned the work from a procedure into a practice. He was finishing panel 43 when one of the Vaelori technicians, the young woman with lavender-tinted skin, approached from the adjacent scaffold section. She'd been doing composite patching on the panels ahead of him, preparing the surfaces for his alignment work, and for the past 2 hours she had been stealing glances at his hands. You do not use the standard release sequence, she said. Her voice was quiet, almost shy, and her comment had the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned it academically rather than conversationally. No, Ren said, not looking up from his pen. The standard sequence is counterclockwise quarter turn, followed by axial lift, followed by lateral extraction. I know what the standard sequence is. You are doing counterclockwise quarter turn, followed by a half-second pause, followed by axial lift. Ren looked up. She was watching his hands with the intensity of someone trying to memorize a song. The half-second lets the collar's internal spring settle, he said. If you lift immediately after the turn, you stress the spring. After 100 pins, the springs are fatigued. After 200, they're weakened. After 300, your collars start developing microplay. The pause costs you 15 minutes over 20 panels. It saves you a collar replacement on every 5th panel. She stared at him. Then she looked at her own hands, long, precise, well-trained hands that had been taught the standard sequence and had never been told there was a reason to deviate from it. May I observe your technique on the next pin? She asked. Sure. She sat on the scaffold platform and watched him do 4 pins. She didn't speak. She didn't take notes. She just watched, and Ren could feel her learning the way her breathing slowed when his hands found the pin, the way her head tilted when he applied the half-second pause, the way her fingers moved unconsciously on her knees as if practicing the motions in miniature. When he finished the 4th pin, she stood up, went back to her section, and resumed her composite work without a word. But Ren noticed that when she handled her own tools for the rest of the shift, her movements had changed. Slightly slower, slightly more deliberate, the echo of a half-second pause. Somewhere around panel 44, he became aware that someone else was watching him. She was standing on the upper observation gallery that ringed Bay 14, a walkway used by ship owners and their staff to observe work in progress without descending to the bay floor. She was Vaelori, tall, even for her species, with skin the color of winter moonlight and hair that fell past her shoulders in a cascade of pale silver white. She wore a long coat of dark blue fabric that caught the bay lights and held them, and even from 30 meters away, Ren could see the quality of the tailoring. This wasn't a technician's coat. This wasn't a dockworker's coat. This was court-class fabric on a court-class frame. The ship's owner. She was watching him work. Not inspecting, there was no data slate in her hands, no diagnostic tool. Just watching the way someone watches a craftsman shape wood or a musician tune an instrument. Unhurried, attentive. Ren looked away and went back to his pins. Panel 44 had 11 pins displaced, and 3 of them had micro-fractures in their locking collars. He flagged those for replacement, pulled spares from his kit, and installed them one at a time. The replacement pins were slightly different in metallurgy, human manufactured, because the Vaelori originals weren't stocked at this facility, and he had to shim each one with a paper-thin washer to compensate for the thermal expansion differential. It was the kind of adjustment that wouldn't show up on any spec sheet. It was the kind of adjustment that kept a panel from developing a whisper rattle at 3 gravities that would drive a pilot slowly insane over the course of a 6-month cruise. He set each shim by feel, tapped it with the flat of his gauge to confirm the seat, and moved on. The woman on the gallery was still there. She hadn't moved. At the end of his first shift, 12 hours, the maximum allowed for a gray badge worker under Vaelori labor code, Ren had completed 5 panels. He was behind schedule. 20 panels in 36 hours meant roughly 2 hours per panel, and he was averaging closer to 2.5. The last 3 panels had been cleaner, their pins less damaged, but the first 2 had eaten into his margin. He climbed down from the scaffolding, cleaned his tools one by one: wrench, bristle brush, file, shims, and the gauge last, wiped with a soft cloth, and returned to its case with the care of someone handling something that mattered more than its weight suggested, and reported to Orath. 5 panels complete, he said, all within tolerance. Orath checked his data slate. Whatever the internal sensors were reading from those 5 panels, it made him pause. His eyes moved across the numbers, then moved again, then went back to the beginning and moved a 3rd time. These readings are within 0.01, he said. The specification is 0.02. I know, Ren said. You are exceeding the specification. The spec is the minimum. I don't work to minimums. Orath's expression shifted. Not dramatically, the Vaelori weren't dramatic people, but something in the tightness around his eyes loosened by a fraction. It wasn't approval. It was the beginning of a question he didn't know how to ask, because the answer would require him to reconsider how he had categorized the person standing in front of him. You are behind schedule, Orath said. I know that too. 15 panels in 24 hours is not feasible at your current pace. It'll get faster. The forward panels took the worst of the impact. The aft sections will be cleaner. And if they are not, then I'll work faster. Orath looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded, not warmth, not acknowledgement, just the mechanical gesture of a supervisor who had received a status report and found it grammatically complete. But his eyes stayed on Ren half a second longer than they needed to, and that half second said more than the nod. Ren went to the workers' quarters. The walk took 6 minutes through maintenance corridors that grew progressively narrower and less polished as he moved away from the service bays. The gray badge section was at the end of a dead-end hallway, past the sanitation equipment storage and the recycling compactors, in a part of the dry dock that the bioluminescent conduit vanes didn't bother to illuminate. His berth was barely wider than his shoulders, with a mattress that was clean but not comfortable, a thin blanket that smelled of industrial detergent, and a light that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious hearing. The berth next to his was occupied by another gray badge worker, a Drenari pipe joiner named Sewell, who was doing ductwork on a freighter in Bay 9. Sewell was asleep when Ren arrived, his breathing a low rasp, his tools arranged neatly on the shelf above his head in the same careful order that Ren kept his own. They'd exchanged nods at the beginning of the shift. That was the extent of gray badge social life. You worked, you slept, you moved on to the next contract. The berths weren't designed for community. They were designed for recovery between shifts, the minimum biological requirement for continued productivity, calculated to the centimeter by someone who had never slept in one. Ren lay down, set his internal clock for 5 hours, and closed his eyes. His hands ached. His knees pulsed with the slow throb of joints that had been kneeling on alloy for 12 hours. In the dark behind his eyelids he saw pins, channels, the gauge's graduated markings, the steady rhythm of release pause clean seat gauge lock. The work followed him into sleep the way good work always does, not as anxiety, but as pattern, the brain continuing to practice what the body had been learning. He dreamed of his mother's hands. They looked like his, the same swollen knuckles, the same calluses, the same fine network of scars from a lifetime of metal edges and hot surfaces. In the dream, she was showing him how to hold the gauge. Don't grip it, she said. Let it rest. The measurement happens in the contact, not the force. He woke, 5 hours exactly. His hands still ached, but the swelling had gone down enough to be useful. He splashed water on his face from the narrow basin, ate a protein bar from his kit, checked his tools, and walked back to Bay 14. The woman was on the gallery again. This time she was closer. She'd moved down to the lower observation level, where the walkway ran parallel to the scaffold platform at a distance of about 10 meters. Ren could see her face more clearly now. She was younger than he'd assumed, late 20s in human terms, which meant somewhere between 40 and 60 in Vaelori years. The conversion was never exact. Her features had the sharp, carved precision that the Vaelori court class were known for. High cheekbones, a jaw that could have been drawn with a straight edge, eyes the color of deep ice, faintly luminous. Subtle pointed ears framed by that silver-white hair. No visible jewelry, no crown, no insignia. But the fabric of her coat had a thread pattern that shimmered when she moved, and Ren had been around enough Vaelori aristocrats on enough stations to know what that thread was. Loriensil, woven from a bioluminescent fiber cultivated exclusively in the sovereign's own textile halls. You couldn't buy it. It was given. She was not just the ship's owner, she was someone. She caught him looking. He looked away, she didn't. Panel 6. Ren knelt and ran the gauge. 9 pins displaced, standard compression damage. He started with pin 1. Release, pause, lift. You use a manual gauge, she said. Her voice carried across the gap between the gallery and the scaffold, with the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms. Ren didn't look up. Yes, ma'am. The Kell series array is faster. It is. Then why not use it? Ren released pin 2's locking collar, let the spring settle, lifted it, cleaned the channel, and repositioned the pin before answering. Because the Kell series tells you where the pin is, the gauge tells you where the pin wants to be. There's a difference. Silence. He could feel her watching, not inspecting, not supervising, considering. The way someone considers a sentence they want to understand fully before responding. My chief engineer says this work should take a team of 4 approximately 20 hours, she said. Your chief engineer isn't wrong, Ren said. If you use a team of 4 and the Kell series, you get the panels within spec in 20 hours. And with 1 technician and a manual gauge, you get panels that won't rattle when you push past 3 standard gravities. You get seals that won't develop micro-fatigue at the pin joints after 3 years of thermal cycling. You get a hull that sounds right when you press your hand against it, not just within tolerance, but settled. The way a hull sounds when every piece of it is exactly where it was designed to be. He hadn't meant to say that much. He usually didn't. But the question had been genuine, not skeptical, not dismissive, but genuinely curious, and genuine questions deserved complete answers. His mother's rule. Another silence, longer this time. The bay lights hummed. A scaffold cable shifted under his weight. What is your name? She asked. Ren called her, maintenance tech, gray badge. The faintest trace of something crossed her face, not amusement, not quite. A crack in the porcelain. As if the combination of his name and his badge level and his willingness to state both in the same breath had revealed something she hadn't expected. I did not ask your badge level, technician called her. Force of habit, ma'am. People usually want to know the badge before they want to know the name. She looked at him steadily. Her ice blue eyes didn't blink. None of them blinked much, the Vaelori, but hers had a stillness to them that went beyond biology. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to hold their reactions behind glass. I am Vaelith Sorenthi, she said. The Solanith is my vessel. The name registered. Ren's hands didn't stop moving pin 3, release, pause, clean, seat, gauge, lock, but somewhere behind his sternum, a wire tightened. Vaelith Sorenthi, third-born daughter of the Vaelori sovereign's senior house. Not a princess in the human sense, the Vaelori didn't use that word, but close enough that the distinction was academic. She was court blood, inner circle, the kind of person whose schedule was managed by a staff of 12, and whose ship was serviced by the dry dock's best available technicians. And her dry dock's best available technician this week was a gray-badge human with dust on his knees. "Ma'am," Wren said, because he didn't know what else to say. There wasn't a protocol for this. There wasn't a line in the gray-badge orientation manual that covered what to do when the ship you were aligning pins on belonged to someone who could buy the dry dock. "Continue your work," technician called her. She stepped back from the gallery rail. "I will not disturb you further." She left. Wren exhaled slowly and went back to his pins. He finished panel 6 in just under 2 hours. He noticed as he climbed down for water that the young Vaelori composite technician was standing at the base of the scaffold, looking at the panel he'd just completed. She had a diagnostic wand in her hand, a standard surface integrity scanner, and she was running it along the panel's edge, checking the seal. She didn't look at Wren when he passed. But when he climbed back up, he saw that she'd left a fresh canteen of water on the platform for him. Cold water, Vaelori filtered, cleaner and colder than anything in his own kit. He drank it. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. There were languages older than words, and a cold drink left for a tired worker was fluent in all of them. Panel 7 took an hour 40. Panel 8, an hour 35. The aft sections were cleaner, just as he predicted, less impact displacement, fewer fractured collars, the pins needing only minor adjustment rather than full reset. His hands found their rhythm, the repetitive precision that his mother had drilled into him in her own repair shop, the work becoming something closer to breathing than thinking. Panel 9. He knelt, ran the gauge, and found something unexpected. All 8 pins were displaced, which was standard, but the displacement pattern was asymmetric. Pins 1 through 4 were off by the expected 3 to 5 millimeters. Pins 5 through 8 were off by a full 7 to 9, significantly more, as if something beneath the panel had shifted independently of the impact compression. He ran the gauge again, same readings. Then he pressed his palm flat against the panel surface and felt. There it was, a faint vibration, so subtle it was more intuition than sensation, the kind of tremor that came not from the panel itself, but from the structure beneath it. Something was misaligned at a deeper level than the surface. He pressed harder, leaning his whole palm into the hull's surface, letting his skin conduct the information his eyes couldn't gather. The vibration had a frequency to it, not random, not the kind of buzz you get from a loose panel or a rattling collar. It was sinusoidal, regular, the kind of vibration that comes from a structural member under asymmetric load, a beam that's carrying weight unevenly because something it was supporting had shifted. He filed it mentally and completed the panel realignment. All 8 pins within tolerance, but the vibration was still there, a whisper in the hull that the gauge couldn't quantify and the pins couldn't fix. It was coming from underneath. Panel 10, 11, each one faster now, each one cleaner. His knees ached with a deep, familiar throb. His fingers developed the swelling at the knuckles that he knew from experience would take 3 days to fade. The scaffold platform was hard Vaelori alloy, and after 16 hours on his knees, even with the pad he'd brought, his joints felt like they were full of ground glass. He didn't stop. Stopping was a choice that required a reason, and sore knees weren't a reason. They were a condition of the work. Between panels, Wren noticed small things. The way the bay lights shifted in intensity as the dry dock's power system cycled through its load-balancing routine, a faint pulse every 90 seconds, almost imperceptible, but enough to change the way shadows fell across the hull's surface. He adjusted his gauge readings to compensate, because shadows could trick the eye into misreading a pin position by half a millimeter. The gauge didn't care about shadows. His eyes did. The discipline was knowing which one to trust. He noticed the temperature, too. The bay ran cool standard for a Vaelori facility. Their preference was a few degrees below what humans found comfortable, and his fingers stiffened slightly in the colder air. He cupped his hands around his canteen, which held water just warm enough to loosen the joints, and waited until the flexibility returned before picking up the gauge again. A stiff hand was a sloppy hand. A sloppy hand was an unacceptable hand. On panel 10, he found a pin that wouldn't seat. It released cleanly, the channel was clear, the gauge showed the rail was true, but when he tried to reseat the pin, it resisted at the last fraction of a millimeter. He tried 3 times. The gauge said it was right. His fingers said it wasn't. He pulled the pin completely and examined it under his work lamp. There a burr on the underside of the pinhead, so small it was invisible to the naked eye but detectable by touch. A manufacturing imperfection, probably present since the pin was installed at the factory, hidden beneath the locking collar where it had never been felt by anyone, because no one had ever pulled this pin and reseated it by hand. The Kell series array would have passed it. The digital readout would have said, within tolerance. But the pin would have carried that burr for the life of the ship, and every time the hull flexed under acceleration, the burr would have scored a microscopic groove in the channel wall, and in 5 years that groove would have become a fatigue crack, and in 10 years the panel would have developed the faintest rattle at high speed. He smoothed the burr with his finest file 3 strokes, no more, each one lighter than the last. Reseated the pin. It clicked home like a key in a lock. No one would ever know he'd done that. The pin would sit in its channel for 20 years, silent and perfect, and no diagnostic would ever flag the correction, because the correction had been made before the problem existed. That was the work. Most of it was invisible, all of it mattered. Oreth came by during the second shift to check his progress. 11 panels complete. The lead technician ran his own diagnostic scan and stood for a long time looking at the numbers. These are within 0.01 on 7 panels, he said. 3 panels are at 0.005. That exceeds factory specification. The rail was clean on those sections, Wren said. When the rail is clean, you can seat tighter. Our senior panel technicians worked to 0.02, Oreth said. He wasn't challenging. He was stating something he was trying to reconcile with what his screen was telling him, the way a man tries to reconcile a map with a territory that doesn't match. 0.02 is good work, Wren said. And 0.005. My mother would have called it adequate. Oreth looked at him. Something was happening behind those pale violet eyes that Wren had seen before in other Vaelori supervisors, the slow, reluctant process of recategorization. Wren Calder was not fitting in the box labeled Gray Badge Human Temp, and the Vaelori didn't have a comfortable box to move him to. The discomfort was not hostility. It was the vertigo of a system encountering data it hadn't been designed to process. You will exceed the deadline, Oreth said. Not a question. I don't think I will. 15 panels in 24 hours. 9 panels, I'm on 12 now, and the aft sections take 90 minutes each. Oreth recalculated. His eyes moved. Wren could almost see the arithmetic happening. 9 panels times 90 minutes, 13.5 hours. He had 22 hours remaining. That leaves a margin of 8.5 hours, Oreth said. Good, I might need them. Panel 9 has a subsurface vibration. Something underneath is off. The structural team cleared the subsurface. They cleared the composite. The vibration isn't composite, it's deeper. Oreth's brow ridges drew together. I will note your observation. The emphasis on the last word was polite but clear. An observation from a gray badge human was filed differently than a finding from a certified Vaelori structural engineer. Wren nodded and climbed back up. At the 20-hour mark, something changed in the bay. He felt it before he heard it, a shift in the air pressure, the kind of subtle change that happens when a large interior space suddenly has more people in it. He looked down from the scaffold and saw 2 Vaelori he hadn't seen before standing with Oreth at the base of the cradle. They wore different uniforms, not dry dock gray blue but deep charcoal with silver piping, the kind of tailoring that screamed military or government. One of them was holding a data slate and gesturing toward the hull. The other was looking up at Ren, with the expression of someone assessing a piece of equipment they hadn't ordered. He went back to his pin. Whatever was happening on the bay floor was above his badge level. Most things were. But part of him, the part that had felt the vibration in panel 9, the part that had noticed the asymmetric pin displacement, the part that had been paying attention to the ship's body language the way his mother had taught him to pay attention to any structure he worked on, that part was already turning the problem over, examining it from angles that had nothing to do with clearance levels or badge colors. 20 minutes later, Oreth climbed the scaffold. This was unusual. Lead technicians supervised from the bay floor, not from the platform. The fact that he had climbed told Ren something was wrong before Oreth opened his mouth. "There has been a complication," Oreth said. Ren set down his gauge. "What kind?" The vessel's navigation array was damaged in the same impact that deformed the hull panels. Our avionics team has been working on it in parallel. They have determined that the array's primary housing was jarred out of its structural cradle by 2.7 millimeters. The vibration, the asymmetric displacement on panel 9, the whisper in the hull that the pins couldn't fix. "That's what I felt," Ren said. Oreth paused. "Explain." Panel 9. The displacement pattern was asymmetric. Pins 5 through 8 were off by 7 to 9 millimeters instead of the 3 to 5 I was seeing everywhere else. That extra displacement wasn't from surface impact, it was from something shifting underneath. A structural cradle moving 2.7 millimeters would do exactly that. Oreth looked at him with an expression that was slowly shedding categories. "You identified a subsurface structural displacement by reading alignment pin offsets. The pins are machined to match the frame beneath them. If the frame moves, the pins tell you. You just have to be looking for it." Another silence. Then, "The housing cradle is integrated into the hull's structural frame at section 49, one of the panels you have already realigned. You need me to pull it and redo it with the housing adjustment factored in." Oreth's silence was an answer. Ren looked down the length of the hull. Section 49 was panel 9, one of his tightest alignments, 0.003 tolerance across all pins despite the asymmetric displacement. Pulling it meant undoing 2 hours of work, accessing the structural cradle that sat beneath the panel, which was a different discipline entirely, a frame-level repair rather than a surface-level alignment, and then reseating every pin with the new geometry factored in. The 2 charcoal-suited Vaelori were still on the bay floor. One of them was speaking into a communicator. The other was watching Ren with undisguised suspicion. "How far off is the housing from its cradle center?" Ren asked. 2.7 millimeters, rotated approximately 4 degrees off the longitudinal axis. "And your avionics team can't shim it from inside." "The housing design does not allow access from the interior. The cradle must be adjusted from the hull side, through the panel. Which means pulling my panel 9, adjusting the cradle, and reseating with a new 0 point. "Correct. I'll need the cradle specs." Oreth's expression tightened. "The engineering office says the specifications are restricted. The navigation array is classified military-adjacent technology. Your badge level does not permit access to the documentation." Ren looked at him. "You want me to adjust a classified structural cradle with no specs? I am informing you of the situation. Can you get me a clearance upgrade?" A temporary clearance elevation for a human gray badge contractor requires authorization from the vessel's registered owner and countersignature from the facility director. Processing time is approximately 9 hours. 9 hours, he had 16 left. "And if I wait 9 hours, I don't make the deadline." "Correct." Ren picked up his gauge. He turned it over in his hands and looked at the initials scratched into the base. Vaelori characters he couldn't read, carved by someone who had held this instrument for years and years, and understood that precision was not a destination but a daily practice. "I don't need the specs," he said. Oreth's brow ridges climbed. "Explain." "The cradle has to center the housing in the array's field alignment. That means it's concentric with the hull's structural members at that section. I can read the structural geometry from the rail system. The pins are machined to match the frame beneath them. If I pull the panel and measure the pin offsets at section 49, I can extrapolate the cradle position, calculate where it should be, and adjust it without documentation." "You are proposing to reverse engineer a classified structural component by reading alignment pins." "I'm proposing to use the information the ship is already telling me, if I listen." Oreth looked at him for a very long time. On the bay floor below, the charcoal-suited official who had been watching Ren said something sharp in Vaelori. Oreth glanced down, then back at Ren. "The Solanith's chief engineer has been consulted. He says the cradle adjustment requires at minimum a Class 4 structural certification and familiarity with the Vaelori's navigation housing mount system. Does he have someone with that certification available?" "The nearest certified Vaelori's technician is at the Kethvener Sovereign Yard, 11 hours by fast transport." "Then he's 20 hours away. I'm here." Another long silence. Something moved behind Oreth's eyes, not decision exactly, but the clearing of ground where a decision could stand. "Proceed," Oreth said. "I will observe." On the bay floor, the taller of the two charcoal-suited officials was speaking into his communicator again. The shorter one had put away his data slate and was watching the scaffold with his arms crossed, and his expression had shifted from suspicion to something more complicated, the expression of someone who was going to have to write a report about this and didn't yet know what category to file it under. Ren ignored them both. Categories were their problem. The cradle was his. He climbed back to section 49. He released the panel carefully, each pin backed out in the reverse order he'd seated them, the gauge confirming each release point, the locking collars stored in sequence so he could reseat them in the same order. When the panel came free, he set it on the scaffold platform and looked at what was underneath. The structural frame was beautiful. Clean alloy members interlocking in a geometric pattern that was distinctly Vaelori, all curves and flowing joints. No hard angles, the structural logic visible in the grain of the metal like the growth rings in a tree. And there, nested at the intersection of three primary members, was the navigation array housing cradle. A precision-machined receptacle about the size of his two fists pressed together, designed to hold the array's primary sensor, housing in perfect alignment with the ship's longitudinal axis. It was off. He could see it without the gauge, a faint asymmetry in the way the cradle sat within its mounting points, a shadow gap on one side that was wider than the other by a margin so small it was nearly invisible. 2.7 millimeters, 4 degrees of rotation, enough to put adrift in any long-range sensor sweep, a whisper of error that would compound over distance until the array's readings became unreliable. He set the gauge against the cradle's mounting surface and took readings. 4 points, cardinal positions, measuring the offset between the cradle and the structural members. Then he did the math in his head, triangulation from known reference points to a target position, the kind of spatial geometry his mother had done with a pencil stub on the back of a packing crate, because she had learned engineering not from a university, but from 30 years of putting things back where they belonged. The correction was 3 micro-adjustments, 2 lateral shims at the lower mounting points, 1 rotational adjustment at the upper bearing. The shims he cut from stock in his kit, thin alloy strips, hand-measured and hand-trimmed with his file, each one checked against the gauge until the thickness was exact. The rotational adjustment he made by loosening the upper bearing mount, applying pressure with a dead blow mallet 3 taps, precisely directed, each one calibrated by feel rather than force, the way you drive a nail the last centimeter into hardwood, not with power but with accuracy and retightening. He set the gauge against the cradle again, dead center. The asymmetry was gone. The shadow gap was even on all 4 sides. He checked a 5th point, the rotational reference, the angular alignment relative to the hull's longitudinal axis, and found it within 0.2 of a degree of factory specification. Without factory specification. His mother had been fond of saying that the universe was full of answers, and the hard part wasn't finding them but knowing which questions to ask. The cradle had been a question about geometry, and geometry didn't care about badge colors. Behind him, on the scaffold platform, he heard Oreth exhale. It was the first involuntary sound the lead technician had made in Wren's presence. Wren reseated the panel. Pin by pin, the same sequence he'd used the first time, but now with the structural geometry corrected beneath, the pins found their channels with a precision that felt different, cleaner, tighter, like a door that had been hanging slightly crooked for years and was suddenly plumb. The gauge readings came back .002 across all 8 pins, better than his first pass. Better than anything he'd done on this ship. He sat back on his heels and flexed his hands. His knuckles were swollen, the skin across his finger joints red and tight. "The cradle is centered," he said. "Your avionics team can remount the housing from inside now." Oreth was already on his communicator. Wren heard the rapid Vaelori, caught fragments his implant managed to translate, centered, manual adjustment, the human. And then Oreth lowered the comm and looked at him with an expression that had moved well beyond confusion into a territory that didn't have a name on the Vaelori emotional map. "The avionics lead confirms the housing is seated correctly," Oreth said. "His diagnostic is reading true center to within .03. He is asking how you obtained the cradle specifications." "Tell him I didn't." Oreth relayed this. There was a silence on the other end that Wren could hear through the comm's tiny speaker. The kind of silence that happens when a specialist hears something that shouldn't be possible. "He does not believe that," Oreth said. There was something in his voice, not amusement. The Vaelori didn't do amusement the way humans did, but perhaps a faint cousin of it. The sound of a man who had watched something happen that his professional framework told him was impossible, and had chosen to believe his eyes over his framework. "He doesn't have to believe it. The housing is centered. That's what matters." On the bay floor below, one of the charcoal-suited officials was speaking into his communicator with the rapid, clipped cadence of someone escalating a report up a chain of command. The other was looking at his data slate, then up at Wren, then back at the slate, as if trying to reconcile 2 things that refused to fit in the same frame. Wren climbed down, drank water, stretched his back until something popped between his shoulder blades with a sound like a knuckle cracking. He rolled his wrists, flexed his fingers, felt the swelling at the joints that told him he'd been gripping too tight for too long. He loosened his grip consciously, another thing his mother had taught him. Tension was the enemy of precision. You held the gauge firmly enough to control it and gently enough to feel through it. Anything more was ego, and ego had no place in the work. 13 panels done, 7 to go, 12 hours remaining. The charcoal-suited official stayed for another hour, conferring in voices too low for Wren's implant to catch. At one point, the taller one climbed partway up the scaffold access ladder and stood there for 5 minutes, watching Wren work from below, his pale violet eyes tracking every movement of the gauge and wrench. Wren ignored him the way he ignored weather. The official climbed back down and spoke urgently to Oreth. Oreth's responses were short, clipped, and from the set of his shoulders deeply uncomfortable. Wren caught one fragment, his readings speak for themselves. When the officials left, Wren noticed that Oreth stood a little straighter than before. as if someone had asked the lead technician to justify a decision, and the justification had been strong enough to carry. He worked through what the dry dock schedule called the night cycle, though in orbit there was no night, just a dimming of the bay lights to 70% and a quieting of foot traffic in the corridors. The scaffolding became a small world. The gauge, the wrench, the bristle brush, the rhythm. Release, pause, clean, seat, gauge, lock. His knees had graduated from sharp pain to a dull heat that radiated up into his hips and settled into his lower back like a second heartbeat. His shoulders were tight. His wrists ached with the constant rotation of the wrench, but his hands were steady. That was what mattered. Everything else, the pain, the exhaustion, the cold bay air, the distant murmur of the dry dock's night shift crew in the corridor, was noise. The signal was the gauge and the pin and the channel and the question they asked each other when brought together. Do you fit? Do you belong here? The answer, pin after pin, was yes. Panel 14, 15, 16. Each one faster now. The aft sections were indeed cleaner, the pins displaced by only 2 to 4 millimeters, the channels free of debris. He could do a clean panel in an hour and 10 minutes if everything cooperated and the aft pins cooperated. They'd been displaced gently, bent rather than broken, and they came back to their rails with the willingness of things returning to where they'd always belonged. Somewhere during panel 15, the young Vaelori composite technician returned. She didn't speak. She climbed the scaffold, sat on the platform 3 meters from where Ren was working, and watched. After 20 minutes, she pulled out her own tool kit and began doing something that Ren didn't notice for several minutes because he was deep in the rhythm of his work. When he looked up, he saw that she was practicing the half-second pause on a spare locking collar she'd brought from the tool store. Release, pause, lift. Over and over, her long, precise fingers learning the timing, finding the interval between the turn and the lift where the spring settled and the stress didn't build. She didn't ask permission. She didn't ask for instruction. She just practiced. Ren said nothing. There was nothing to say. The work taught itself when someone was ready to learn. On panel 16, he found a second pin with a factory burr identical to the first, hidden beneath the collar, invisible to digital diagnostics. He smoothed it. 3 strokes. The pin seated perfectly. He wondered how many burrs were hiding in the hundreds of panels he'd never touch on the thousands of ships he'd never work on, and he filed the thought away in the same place he filed all the things he couldn't control. The work in front of him was what mattered, this pin, this channel, this panel, the next. At the 28-hour mark, with 4 panels remaining, Vaelith Sorrenthi came to the scaffold. Not to the gallery, to the scaffold. She climbed the access ladder in her court-class coat, her silver-white hair tied back, and stepped onto the platform where Ren was kneeling over panel 17. He looked up and found her standing 3 meters away, looking at his hands. "You have not slept," she said. "I'll sleep when they're done. Your hands are swelling." He looked at his knuckles. She wasn't wrong. The joints were visibly enlarged, the skin taut and discolored, red fading to purple at the worst points, the knuckle of his right index finger swollen enough that the skin had gone shiny. Repetitive stress inflammation. It would take a week to heal properly, and he'd spend most of that week doing this same kind of work on another ship at another station. "They still work," he said. "How many panels remain?" "4, including this one." She looked along the hull at the 16 completed sections, their surfaces seamless and flush, indistinguishable from panels that had never been moved. Then she looked at him, at his gray badge, his dust-stained work pants, his kit bag with its worn tools and hand-cut shims, and the crystal gauge resting in its open case. "My chief engineer examined your work on the navigation cradle," she said. "He says the correction you made is within 1/10 of what the factory specification would have required, and you made it without seeing the specification." "The ship told me where it needed to be," Ren said. "I just listened." Something happened in her face. Not a crack in the porcelain this time, a window opening. Her ice-blue eyes held him, and he saw, behind their stillness, something that looked like recognition. Not the Vaelori political kind with its formal declarations and rank adjustments and ceremonial ribbons. Something older than that. Something that existed before courts and titles and badge colors, the simple act of one person seeing another person's competence and understanding what it cost them to carry it. My father's shipwright used a gauge like that one, she said, nodding at the instrument in his hand. Hand-machined, crystalline, graduated markings etched by a jeweler. He said that a digital tool measures distance. A hand gauge measures intent. Wren looked at the gauge, at the worn grip, at the scratched initials in the base. Those initials, he said, on the base. Vorathan Shale, she said, my father's shipwright. He served the sovereign house for 43 years. That gauge was his. He donated his tools to the facility's training stock when he retired. Most of them were replaced within a year. She paused. That one was not. No one used it. No one knew how. The younger technicians preferred digital arrays. Faster, they said, more reliable. They were not wrong about the speed. Her voice was careful, precise, each word placed like a stone in a wall. They were wrong about what reliability meant. Wren turned the gauge over in his hands. 43 years of service. Donated. Filed away. A tool built to sub-millimeter precision, designed to be held by someone who understood that measurement was a conversation between the instrument and the material, not a reading to take but a question to ask. And it had sat in a case in a training closet because the technicians who came after used digital arrays that were faster and easier and almost as good. Almost. He would have approved of your work, Vaelith said. He was difficult to satisfy. So was my mother. The faintest shift at the corner of her mouth, not a smile. Vaelori aristocrats didn't smile, not where anyone could see, not in front of a gray badge contractor standing on their ship's scaffold. But the architecture of the expression moved, and what lived underneath was warm. Complete the panels, technician called her, she said. She turned toward the ladder. Ma'am. She stopped. The shimming on the Section 49 cradle, Wren said. The alloy I used for the shims is human manufactured. It's got a slightly higher thermal expansion coefficient than your Vaelori stock. At standard operating temperatures, it'll be fine. But if you push the engines hard enough to get hull temperatures above 400 Kelvin, the shims will expand 0.01 millimeters more than the surrounding structure. It won't affect the panel. But it might put a ghost vibration in the navigation array's high-frequency band. It'll show up as a faint oscillation in your long-range sensor returns, nothing you'd see in standard nav. But if you're doing precision astrometric work, you'd notice. She turned back to him. Her expression was the stillness again, but a different quality of stillness, the kind that happens when someone is revising an assessment they'd already revised twice. You are telling me this because the standard diagnostic would not catch it. No, ma'am, it wouldn't. And you could have said nothing, and I would never have known. Probably not. Then why? Wren looked at the gauge in his hand, at the initials, at the graduated markings, each one placed with the care of someone who understood that precision was not about getting it right, but about being honest when you couldn't. Because your father's shipwright would have told you, he said. Vaelith Sorrenthi stood on the scaffold platform of Bay 14 and looked at a gray-badge human maintenance technician with swollen hands and dust on his knees and a 43-year-old gauge in his grip. And for 3 seconds she did not move and did not speak and did not blink. The bay lights hummed. A scaffold cable creaked. The vast hull of the Solanith curved away behind them both, her panels gleaming, her structure sound, her navigation cradle centered to a tolerance that her own engineers hadn't been able to reach. I will have my chief engineer note the thermal limitation in the maintenance log, she said, attributed to your assessment. That's not necessary, ma'am. I'm gray badge. My assessments don't go in official logs. They will go in mine. She descended the ladder. Her court-class coat caught the bay light as she stepped onto the floor, the Loriental thread shimmering blue and gold, and she walked toward the bay exit without looking back. At the door, she stopped and spoke to Orath, who had been standing at the base of the scaffolding for the last 10 minutes with his data slate hanging at his side and his mouth slightly open. Ren couldn't hear what she said. But he saw Orath straighten, saw the lead technician's hand go to his chest in what Ren recognized as a Vaelori gesture of formal acknowledgement, the kind reserved for directives from court blood, not for casual instructions, and saw Vaelith walk through the door and disappear. Orath climbed the scaffold. His face had the expression of a man who had just been told something that reorganized his understanding of several things simultaneously. The vessel owner has requested that your work be formally logged in the Solonith's maintenance record, he said. Under your name, full attribution. She has authorized a notation that the navigation cradle correction was performed manually, without access to restricted specifications, by technician Ren Calder. Ren's hand stopped moving. For the first time in 28 hours, his hand stopped. That's a court-class maintenance record, he said. Yes. Gray badge contractors don't get named in court-class records. We get logged by badge number. If we're lucky, by station assignment. She is aware of that. She has also requested that the thermal expansion advisory be logged under your name as a materials compatibility notation, a formal flag that will appear on every future service order for the Solonith's navigation array. A materials compatibility notation. Ren's mother had worked her entire career without getting one of those attributed to her name. It was the kind of entry that turned a technician from a badge number into a reference, a person whose judgment was part of the ship's permanent record, whose observations would be read by every engineer who ever opened that file. I still have 3 panels to finish, he said. Then finish them. He turned back to pin 1 of panel 18, released the collar, pause, lift, cleaned the channel, seated the pin, set the gauge, 0.002, locked. Pin 2. Panel 18 went fast, 1 hour and 5 minutes, all pins clean, no complications. Panel 19 took longer. One of the locking collars had a hairline fracture in its retention spring, and Ren spent 20 minutes hand-fitting a replacement from his kit, adjusting the spring tension until the collar seated with the same click as the factory original. It was the kind of repair that a certified Vaelori technician would have handled by ordering a new collar assembly, filing a parts requisition, waiting for delivery, and installing it according to the manual. Ren fixed it with a pair of needle-nose pliers, a shim the thickness of a hair, and the knowledge that a spring is just a piece of metal that wants to be a certain shape and will cooperate if you let it. Panel 20, the last one, section 60 at the aft edge of the damage zone where the impact had been weakest. 6 pins, all displaced by less than 3 millimeters, all channels clean. He could have rushed through it in 40 minutes. He didn't. He gave each pin the same attention he'd given every pin before it, the same release sequence, the same pause, the same careful seating, the same gauge reading, the same lock. The last pin was not less important than the first. It was not less visible. It was not less deserving of the full measure of his skill. His mother had told him that once when he was 18 and tired and trying to hurry through the last repair of a long day. She had taken the wrench from his hand gently and said, "The ship doesn't know which pin was first and which was last. Every pin thinks it's the only one. Treat it that way." He treated it that way. He finished the last panel at the 34-hour mark, 2 hours ahead of deadline. When he ran the final gauge check, all 20 panels, all 163 pins, every one within 0.02, most within 0.01, 11 of them at 0.003 or better. He sat on the scaffold platform and let his hands rest in his lap and breathed. The Solonith gleamed in the bay lights. Her port side was seamless, no sign of the impact, no trace of the damage. the hull panels flowing in the same organic curves as the day she'd been launched. Beneath those panels, her navigation cradle sat centered and true, shimmed with human alloy and adjusted by a hand gauge that had been made 43 years ago by a craftsman whose name Wren would remember. Orath met him at the base of the scaffold. 20 panels, the lead technician said. Average tolerance .012, 7 panels below .005. Navigation cradle centered to factory specification without documentation access. He paused. In 34 hours, with 1 technician. With 1 gauge, Wren said. Orath looked at him. The recategorization was complete now. Wren could see it in the way the Vaelori held himself, the slight forward lean of someone who had found respect for a person, and discovered that the feeling was heavier than expected, because it required admitting that the earlier absence of respect had been an error. The facility director has approved a recommendation from the vessel owner, Orath said, a standing advisory contract. The Solonith's maintenance record will carry your name as a reference technician for hull and structural work. Any future service on the vessel may be directed to you by request. A standing advisory. Wren Calder Gray Badge Temporary Labor, now referenced by name in the maintenance log of a court-class Vaelori yacht. It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't a rank change. His badge was still gray. His quarters were still the narrow berth at the end of the maintenance corridor. His pay rate hadn't moved. It was a notation, a line in a record, a formal acknowledgement that he had been here and that his work had mattered. It was the most any gray badge human had ever been given at Kethvenor, and it was exactly enough. Tell the vessel owner I appreciate it, Wren said. You may tell her yourself. She has requested a brief word before you depart. Wren looked at Orath. The lead technician was holding his data slate the way people hold things they've forgotten they're holding loosely, because something else has claimed their attention. Lead technician, Wren said. Yes. The young composite tech, the one with the lavender tint. Technician Elera, what about her? She has good hands, better than good. She was watching my pin technique and learning the half-second pause inside of 20 minutes. That's rare. Most people take a week to unlearn the standard release sequence before they can learn a new one. She did it by observation in 1 shift. Orath looked at him. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you she has the instinct for manual gauge work. If anyone at this facility is going to use that gauge, he stopped, because the gauge was no longer going to be at this facility. It was going to be wherever Vaelith Sorenthi decided to send it. Never mind, she's good. Someone should tell her. Someone just did, Orath said. Wren cleaned his tools. Each one wiped, inspected, and returned to its place in the kit bag in the order his mother had taught him: wrench first, then bristle brush, then file, then shims in their labeled pouch, then the spare collars and pins in their compartmentalized case. The gauge last, wiped with the soft cloth, held for a moment, then placed in its foam-lined case and latched shut. His mother had always said that cleaning your tools was the last act of a job and the first act of the next one. And she was right about that, the way she was right about most things. He packed his kit, climbed down from the scaffold for the last time. His knees screamed when they straightened, and his hands looked like they belonged to someone 20 years older, and his back had developed a knot between the shoulder blades that would need a hot compress and a week he wouldn't get. Vaelith Sorenthi was waiting at the bay door. No entourage, no staff, no chief engineer, no charcoal-suited officials. Just her in her Loriental coat, her silver-white hair loose again, her ice-blue eyes steady. "Technician Calder," she said. "Ma'am." She held out her hand. In it was the gauge, the crystalline instrument with the worn grip, and the scratched initials, and the graduated markings that told you where the pin wanted to be. "This is yours now," she said. Wren looked at the gauge, at her hand, at her face, where the stillness had thinned enough to show what was underneath, and what was underneath was something that Wren, standing in a dry dock bay with swollen hands and a gray badge and dust on his knees, recognized as clearly as a centered pin. Respect, not given from above, not bestowed by rank or authority or court protocol. Earned across 34 hours and 163 pins, one at a time, by someone who had done the same thing correctly again and again until the work spoke for itself. Ma'am, that gauge belonged to your father's shipwright. It's part of the sovereign house's history. It belongs to someone who knows how to use it. Vorathan would have agreed. Wren took the gauge. It was heavy in his hand, heavier than before, or maybe the same weight carried differently now. He ran his thumb across the initials in the base. V.S. Vorathan Shale, 43 years. A man he had never met, whose tool he had been using for 34 hours, who had understood that measuring was not a task but a conversation. "Thank you," he said. Vaelith nodded, not the mechanical nod of a supervisor, not the formal acknowledgement of a court aristocrat. A human nod, the kind that meant the conversation had been heard and that hearing it had mattered. "Safe travels, Wren Calder," she said. She walked back into the Soloneth. The gangway retracted. The bay lights shifted to departure configuration, amber and pale blue together, warm and cool in the same frame. Wren clipped the gauge to his belt, not in the case, not in his kit bag, but on his belt, where he could feel its weight against his hip, where it belonged. He shouldered his kit bag and walked back down the main corridor toward the shuttle bay. His gray badge caught the bioluminescent light from the conduit veins in the corridor walls. Vaelori technicians passed him without looking, the same technicians who had ignored him 34 hours ago when he'd walked this corridor in the opposite direction. Kit bag on his shoulder, dust on his boots, a name nobody asked for attached to a badge nobody valued. They still didn't look. That hadn't changed, but something else had, and it didn't need anyone to look at it to be real. His knees ached, his hands throbbed, his back was a landscape of knots and fatigue. At the last security checkpoint, the Vaelori guard scanned his badge and waved him through without eye contact. Business as usual, gray badge, human, moving along. But as Wren passed, the guard's hand paused on the scanner, a half-second hesitation, as if the readout had shown him something unexpected. Maybe the standing advisory, maybe the court-class log notation, maybe just a glitch. The guard said nothing, and Wren didn't look back. He was already thinking about the next station, about the next set of pins that would need to come home, about the next ship that would tell him something if he was patient enough to listen. Somewhere in the maintenance log of a court-class Vaelori yacht, a line had been added. It carried his name and the tolerances he had held, and an advisory about thermal expansion that no one else would have thought to mention. It was a small line. It would be read by perhaps 3 people. It would not change his badge color, or his pay rate, or the width of the berth he slept in. But it was there, and it was accurate, and it had his name on it. That was enough. For Wren Calder, it had always been enough.